Looking for a guaranteed way to create content that resonates with your audience? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients and let them choose the topic of the interview. Because if your ideal clients care about the topic, there's a good chance the rest of your audience will care about it too. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth and to another episode of a series we created called Category Creation. I'm John Ruggi, your host for today's episode. So our guest for today is Stu Heineke. And in addition to being a genuinely nice guy, Stu is also a Wall Street Journal cartoonist, a Hall of Fame nominated marketer, the best-selling author of How to Get a Meeting with Anyone, and the president of an agency called Cartoon Link, as well as the founder of cartoonists.org. So if you know anything about Stu's work, you've heard him talk about this idea of what he's termed contact marketing. And I'm really excited for y'all to hear Stu's take on what that is and how this type of marketing has really come into its own. So Stu, thanks for being on the show. How are you doing today?
Oh, great. And a great pleasure to join you.
Awesome. Well, look, before we get into the idea of contact marketing and that as a category, tell us a little bit about yourself and your own background.
Well, I have kind of a crazy background, I think. I'm a marketer. My education is in marketing, but I've been a cartoonist my whole career as well, and found early on that I could combine the two really quite effectively. Cartoons, magazines and newspapers have been running readership surveys for a long, long time to find out what gets read and remembered. And what they've constantly discovered is that, I guess they discovered it and it's constantly confirmed to them that cartoons are almost always the best read and remembered parts of any magazine or newspaper, any publication they're in. And I thought, well, early on, that's really interesting because, we're always looking for a device like that in marketing. How do we get somebody's attention? How do we get them to not just you could shoot a flare at someone and get their attention, but how do we get their attention in a very positive way? And cartoons do that just beautifully. So I've ended up mixing the two, and I'm mixing them in a lot of different ways. I've created a lot of direct marketing campaigns for some of the biggest direct marketers in the world at the time, with a lot of the magazine publishers and other pharmaceuticals and some of the sports leagues, et cetera. And the other thing, though, was that I discovered was that I could use my cartoons and break through to just about anybody. And of course, getting meetings with important people, it's just a universal challenge that we all have, not just in business, but in life. Good things happen when we connect with the right people. And if you can't get through, and that's often the case, it's very hard to get a hold of people these days. If you have something in mind that you'd like to talk to them about or maybe propose, it's really hard if they don't know you. And so you can, although there are a lot of ways to overcome that. And so, I discovered that cartoons were getting me through to anybody. I was reaching presidents and prime ministers, celebrities, and so I was kind of playing with it to see how far could it go, and eventually discovered that, well, I'm not the only person out there doing something interesting to get a hold of people. And in fact, actually, there's this whole shadow practice, or this whole community of people who have been doing really, really interesting things to break through to their most important contacts. And so that the more I heard about it, the more I heard these stories, the more I realized, God, I've got to do a book. And so that book was, well, How to Get a Meeting with Anyone. And it's been a really interesting ride because, again, they're just, people have done the most incredible things, John, to break through to important people. And as I interviewed a lot of these people, a lot of these sources for the book, I realized that I kept asking them, by the way, what do we call this? Because I called my first campaign a contact campaign. I didn't know what to call it. There wasn't a term for it. But I just thought, well, okay, I'll call it a contact campaign just so I can call it something. And I kept asking all these experts in sales and in marketing, what is this called that we're doing? And no one had a name for it. No one knew. So that's where actually contact marketing came from.
Yes, that's really interesting. You were going down this road of exploring kind of highly personalized, fairly kind of out of the box tactics, and you discovered that you weren't the only one doing this. Other people were doing that. So to help kind of espouse that practice, you came up with this term, contact marketing.
Yep.
And I know earlier you mentioned you've got a definition for it, and I'm sure I've probably read it in your book, but I'd love to hear it fresh today.
I mean, if we think about marketing campaigns, they're generally focused on a lot of people. That's not always true, and it's certainly not true. Let's say with retargeting, for example, or maybe Facebook advertising, something like that. It is quite a bit narrower than just this general campaign. But in general, marketing is geared to reach and influence the behavior of a lot of people all at once. And contact marketing is very, very different because we're focusing on just a few people. It could be the campaign could go to as few as one person. And so it's a very, very different form of marketing. Not only that, not only is it different because of the really rifle focus of rifle shot versus scatter shot focus of the campaigns, but there are also some really crazy metrics that come out of this as well that really they actually sound sort of like marketing heresy. But for the definition, I would call it a fusion of marketing and selling. And that's interesting too, because usually marketing and selling are sort of separate silos. They don't come together. But here it's a fusion of marketing and selling, in which we often use these very audacious forms of marketing. I use my cartoons a lot, but that's almost tame compared to what some of the things other people are doing. So we're using audacious forms of marketing that are really, they're meant to support a specific high-level sales approach to some sort of VIP prospect or account. And I would say that the rest of the definition really, it describes the levels of response that you get. And really, it often results in response levels so high that we've seen 100% response rates happen quite a bit. And then ROI, that is just, these are numbers. I mean, like there's one campaign that generated a 3.5 million % ROI, which is a really hard number to understand. Just to wrap your head around, what does that mean? I know what 100% means. It means all of it, but what does 3.5 million % mean? And then finally, all of this leads to explosive growth of the enterprise if it's all working correctly.
So if I heard you right, there's 4 components. So one was, I'm not going to get the wording right, but it was audacious tactics of getting in touch with specific people. And 2 was to drive, it was a high ROI. And then 3rd was explosive growth. I feel like I missed one in there. Can you
there is one.
Recap it for me?
And that is, the scale of these are usually quite small. We're really focusing on the people who are most important to us, the people who can change the scale of our business if they become clients or a partner, something along those lines. So it's a fusion of marketing and selling, and it's focused on helping sales teams reach their most important accounts.
Good deal. Good. Well, I know, if someone wants to learn more about contact marketing specifically, you've been on the show before. You talk about that at length. I think you talk about maybe 5 tactics to get in touch with people. And obviously, your book itself has a wealth of information. But since we're on the category creation series today, I'd love to dive a little bit more deeper into why you not only named that category, but why you continue to espouse it and evangelize that term. So in other words, why not just tell people that you help get these 3.5 million % ROI returns on their marketing campaigns and leave it at that? Can you help us understand just kind of the power of naming something and what that's done for your business?
Well, I think naming it wasn't so much a strategy for promoting my business so much as just it needed a name. We needed to be able to talk about it. And I think actually, if you get to name someone, I mean, this is about category creation. And I think if you are ever in a position to say, hey, look, there's something that we're doing, something that's happening, and no one has a name for it, we need to give it a name. I think you're in a really, really fortunate position to be able to do it. because if it sticks, then you're the one who's always associated with it. So ultimately, that is good for your business, certainly. But it came from just, we got to call it something, and there's something really, really unique here, because if we have a form of marketing that it's bizarre in so many ways, but it's going to just a handful of people perhaps, and it's producing response rates that are just unimaginable. I mean, when I was working in direct marketing or direct response, we used to hear that to a mail campaign that a 1% response rate was doing really, really well. That's not really, there is no such number actually. I mean, you can't just pick a number like that. But they also used to say that 100% response rates were impossible. But, here are people like, let's say, Dan Waldschmidt sending swords out to CEOs of companies that have just missed their earnings estimates. And these sword campaigns have produced 100% response rate for him. Every time he sends one out, they make contact. And when you see campaigns like that happening, it deserves a name. You just got to call it something so we can start talking about it, and everyone knows what we're talking about.
And I think to an extent, it really sets you up as an authority on the practice, as opposed to your specific take on contact marketing, which happens to be around cartoons, right? So you can talk about your specific methodology or your kind of go-to tactic, but because you've named this category and you've put the thought into the definition, and you were really the first person to kind of coin that term, you can talk about the practice more holistically.
Yeah, and I think what really gives me that ability is researching and then writing these books. So, How to Get a Meeting with Anyone is out now. I'm working on the next one, which will come out in November next year, called Even More Outrageous Ways. I think that's what it is. Even More Outrageous Ways to Get a Meeting with Anyone. Just sort of a follow-on, because there were, as soon as the book came out, I kept hearing from people saying, "Hey, but wait a minute, there's this," and that someone, Curtis Brooks, got in touch with me and talked about unsolicited proposals, which were brilliant, and they're getting them through to the C-suite all the time. And others had other stories, and then really interesting story. This one guy read How to Get a Meeting with Anyone and put together a campaign. These stretched canvas cartoon prints that were personalized for each recipient. A little different from what I do, but anyway, pretty similar to it. And his CEO walked by, saw what he was doing. He said, what is this? What are you doing? And he said, well, I'm using these because I want to reach the, maybe a dozen accounts that none of us have been able to reach. And the CEO said, that's never going to work. And so Lee and the CEO made a bet, and the CEO lost. In fact, I think Lee was getting 100% response rate to that campaign. Wow. So it's just fun to be able to gather up all these amazing stories, and they all fit under this umbrella of contact marketing. I think that's probably the biggest utility of this, is it does all fit under that one umbrella of contact marketing. And I think just sort of as a device, it gets people excited because they're saying, "Oh, that's what I've been doing," and invites conversation and certainly a lot more discovery. I love hearing what other people are doing to break through still, because there's still all these methods that I haven't heard of. I'm still learning about it. But I would say, though, that forming that or naming the category contact marketing and doing that in the book, How to Get a Meeting with Anyone, and then researching the two books now, certainly gives me the position to, or puts me in the position to discuss a lot of holistically what this is. I mean, again, cartoons are one of the things that I do, but as I've studied all this, there's certainly not the only way to get through. It's certainly not the only way that we'll offer our clients, our agency clients, to get through.
So it sounds like naming the category, it allows people to talk about it and kind of relate these different tactics to each other in the same context, right? So now you can start to tell these stories, which just makes the idea so much more powerful.
Yeah, it does, because it gives it a name. And actually, I think it gives people a handle to hold on to say, okay, that's what this is. And then it makes it easier to talk about it and realize, oh, I'm doing the same thing, actually. Right. And people end up sort of feeling like they belong to that.
So, one of the themes that we're talking about in this category creation series is this idea of wanting the category to be bigger than just you, right? Because if it's just you, if it's just Stu Heineke is the contact marketing guy, that's not really a category. It might be a really powerful way to describe what you do personally, but ultimately you want the category to be adopted by others to really legitimize it. Yep. But at the same time, you want to maintain that ownership that that you've built as the owner of that category, or someone who coined that phrase, because there's a lot of power that comes from that. I remember, before our call, I Googled contact marketing, and articles with your name came up, and they talked about how you coined that term back in 2016. So how do you balance the two, do you think, between one, wanting others to use that term, espouse it, take it on, but then also maintaining your ownership as kind of the leader of that space?
Well, the weird thing is, I'm not very concerned about ownership of it at all. It's something, if you do create a category, you've got to share it with the world. And you've got to realize that, for it to become a category or be a category, other people have to join in. And they have to do it. They have to become experts at it as well. And you got to just share the stage with them. So I'm not really, I think the more you hoard something, the less it becomes a category. Mm-hmm. People have to participate in it. So yeah, I'm actually happy to share it with the world. And in fact, what's interesting is you are a co-host with James Carberry on the business or B2B growth show. And, so if James had said, well, I'm going to hoard this for myself, I don't want anybody else on my podcast, he'd have less of a podcast, right? I mean, having you come in, and I know he has other guest hosts, and certainly I'm starting to open up the How to Get a Meeting with Anyone podcast to co-host, because there are people there. I'm not the whole story. I never thought I was, and shouldn't be. I'm a facilitator of the story, but I'm not the whole story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's really poignant. If you hold on to it too tightly, you don't really allow that category to take on any power, and then it kind of loses a lot of its effectiveness. It's just something that applies to you and you alone, and that's not really what a category is about. So I like how you talked about just letting and encouraging others to take that on and making it bigger, something bigger than you, and how that's really, it sounds like it's beneficial for you to take that on. It allows what you do to become much more powerful than anything you could do through your own efforts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I've got just one last question for you, Stu, before we go today. If one of our listeners is out there and they're thinking that they want to put a name to something that people have been practicing, or there's something unique out there that they feel really needs to have a term to describe it, what's your advice for how they should go about that process?
Well, I think you probably need to confirm that it actually is or should be a category. If I had called this cartoon door openers instead of contact marketing, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. And that's not really, that's a very small category. So I think the first thing is to put the time into understanding how much of a category is it? Is it bigger than you? You just mentioned that as a desire of someone who's creating a category or naming the category to have it become bigger than them. But I think it already starts out being bigger than you. So is it something you're identifying that is out there? It's already happening, or maybe it's a category that needs to be out there, that will be answering a need that's out there that we know, or will create a solution for people, and people will adapt it pretty readily. I think that's it. No, having said that, though, I think when you give something a name, particularly if it's a compelling name, the name itself becomes a propellant, because it's just sort of, I don't know, it seems to resonate with people, and from there they hold on to the concept more easily. I can't think of any other example other than maybe creative destruction. I think that's what it was called, and that was a term coined back in the 40s, actually. But creative destruction is a pretty interesting. I mean, create is making something, and destruction is knocking it down. So what does that mean to do the two? I think that's kind of an interesting concept, and it causes people to, I think, understand it better, because the name actually does explain that this is or it certainly alludes to the fact that old models need to be destroyed in order to have new models emerge. So giving it a name certainly helps it spread.
And along with that, what you're saying is it's not just, I think your example was, it can't be like cartoon-based door openers. I'm so glad you didn't name it that. I don't think I would have bought the book if that was a subtitle. but keeping it more than just about yourself enables that exercise to be so much more powerful. So I think it's a great piece of advice to leave our audience with. Look, thank you so much for being on the show today, Stu. If one of our listeners wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, John, it was a pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me on. I think the easiest way to find me, you can find Cartoon Link and you can find cartoonist.org. But I think the easiest way to get hold of me is just on LinkedIn. And so you need to know how to spell my name. Stu is S-T-U, and then Heineke is H-E-I-N-E-C-K-E.
Got it. Well, thanks again, Stu. It was a pleasure having you. Look, if you guys like what you heard today as listeners and you want to learn more about category creation, subscribe to the B2B Growth Show and look for episodes with the category creation hashtag. Outside of this series, there's tons of great content as well. But look, I'm John Ruggie. I'm your host for today's episode. If you have any questions or want to propose a guest for the series, I'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch with me by going to john.ruggie. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. You know all those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.